Masechet Kiddushin Daf Kaf Gimel. We're talking about the Mishnah that says an Eved Kena'ani can be acquired in three ways, Kesef, Shtar, and Chazakah. That was simple enough. But now we get to a paradox, two paradoxes in fact. According to the Bimeir, Konet Asmo Bechesef Al Yedei Acherim. In order to achieve his freedom with Kesef, that can only be done by others. In other words, if someone wants to redeem the slave, then that person, someone else, has to give money directly to the owner and say, here, I am redeeming this slave. But the implication is not by his own means. In other words, that person cannot give money to the slave himself and say, here is the money of your redemption that you can then give to the master. It has to come from a third party. It cannot come from the slave himself. We'll have to discuss why. But regarding shtar, it's the opposite. The shtar goes the opposite direction also. The master gives the shtar, so he can give it to the slave himself, but he cannot give it to a third party. Well, what's the difference between kesef and shtar? How come kesef only works with a third party and shtar doesn't work with a third party? So we'll have to explain that. And that's all to be Meir's opinion. After that, we're going to have to explain Chachamim, who say the exact opposite. So let's begin with the Gemara. The Gemara infers correctly that regarding kesef, he can acquire it. He can acquire his freedom only with a third party who gives the money directly to the master, but not if the slave himself has the money and gives it to the master. What kind of case are we talking about? If you say, we're going to see why this is important in a minute. Is it with the consent of the slave or not? If we say it's without his consent, he was not present or didn't say anything or said that he doesn't want to be free. So we know that according to the Bimeir, everybody has the principle that you can do something in for someone's benefit even without them knowing about it. I can pick up $100 bill and say, you know what, my friend Bob, he would really enjoy this. I'm going to pick it up, and as soon as I do that, he acquires it. It's actually his, even though he doesn't even know about it, because that's a benefit. But I can't do something to the detriment of someone that's not here, who's not here. I can't, make a debt for someone who why would he want that debt? Okay, so that's the general rule. Now, regarding slavery, most people would think that it's bad to be a slave. It's good to be free, so therefore you can free someone even without their consent. That would seem to be true. However, that's not to be Meir's opinion. He says it's actually a detriment for a slave. It could be a detriment anyway to go free. There are certain benefits that an Eved Kanani has that a free person does not. Remember, Eved Kanani, while his Eved Kanani is still in between category, he has to do mitzvot like a woman does, but not like a man. If he's a man and he goes free, now he becomes a full ger. He has to take upon himself more mitzvot. So that's a liability. He'll be liable if he does certain things. While he's a slave, he's allowed to be more promiscuous. Once he's free, he can't have all those relations. If his master is a Kohen and he's a slave, he can eat terumah. Once he goes free, he can't eat terumah anymore. While he's a slave, the master is providing him food, shelter, clothing. Whether the master is obligated to or not is a different question, but let's say he is, and so he says, you know what, I like my situation here. Don't free me, I don't want that. Okay, so it can't be that we're talking about a case that's against his consent, because then it wouldn't work al yedei acherim, that someone else could come and give money directly to the master, and then the slave, he's just sitting in his room and he suddenly goes free, right? He never consented to this, so it can't be that case. Ela peshita midato. Rather has to be, they asked him, right? He's present. He said, right, you okay? You want to be freed? He says yes. And then someone comes and gives money of redemption to the owner. That will work. Okay, so now we understand why al yedei acherim works. Now, al yedei acherim in al yedei asmo la alma en kinyan eved belo rabo. How come it doesn't work to give the money to the slave himself and the slave can give it to the owner? Because there is no acquisition by a slave without the master. The problem is a slave's hand is an extension of the owner's hand. And if the slave finds something that's lost, or makes something, does something with his hands, acquires something, it automatically goes to the master. So if a friend or a relative gives money to the slave as a gift, right? He's giving to him as a gift. Here you go. And then the slave will give it to the owner as his redemption. It won't work, because as soon as that third party gives the money to the slave as a gift, it goes right into the owner's bank account. The owner already has it. Thank you for the gift. And there is no redemption. So this explains why a third party can give it directly to the owner. That will work with the owner's consent. But a third party cannot give it to the slave as a gift, and then the slave give it to the owner. That will not work. Okay, so now we got the first clause. Now we have to apply the same assumptions to the next clause. Bishtad al yedei atzmo, al yedei atzmo'in, al yedei acherim la. Vimidato al yedei acherim amai la. Regarding a shtad, that Rabbi Meir said, he can receive the shtad himself, the slave, but, and we infer, only if he receives it himself, the master cannot give the shtad to a third party. And now we wonder, you just established that this is with his consent, the slave's consent. Therefore, what's wrong with the master giving the shtad to a third party on behalf of the slave, and the slave gives his consent? There would be nothing wrong with that. So we say, mi bechitamamai al yedei asmo, af al yedei asmo. So maybe we could read the Mishnah when it says he can acquire the shtad himself. It means also by himself, and all the more so if the owner gives the shtad to someone else. And what's the chidush there? The chidush is that, of course, if the owner gives the shtad to a third party, the third party can acquire it on his behalf. The chidush is if the owner gives it to the slave himself, and you might say, well, whatever the slave acquires goes right back to the master. So he never acquired the shtad and never acquired his freedom. So this is teaching us, Bimei is teaching us that regarding a shtad, as soon as he receives the shtad, he simultaneously receives his freedom, so that right at the same time, see, if one comes before the other, then it won't work, because if he receives the shtad while he's a slave, he doesn't receive the shtad. It goes back to the master, and so he can never get free in the first place in order to have a hand. But if you say both happen at exactly the same time, he receives his freedom and he receives the shtad all at once, so he's free and he can receive something with his hand, which is his own document of freedom. And so that's what it's teaching, and that is a plausible reading of the Mishnah. The problem is it contradicts the Baraita. The Baraita says, according to the Rabbi Meir, a shtad can only work if he receives it himself and not if the master gives it to a third party. So we can't read it that way. Instead, we have to go back to the drawing board. Amar Abaye le'olam shelo mida'ato. Now you understand the structure of the Gemara. First, it started off saying shelo mida'ato. We said that can't be, so it has to be mida'ato. But we said that can't be either. So we had to go through this exercise so that we can come back to the first one and explain it. In fact, the slave did not give his consent. Okay, that explains the shtad. That's why he can receive the shtad himself. If he receives it, then that's his consent. But if he's not around and not giving consent, and the owner gives the shtad to a third party, that's why it doesn't work, because it didn't get his consent. Well, now what about kesef? V'shane kesef ho'il v'kanile be'al korche maknile be'al korche. Kesef is not going. Kesef can work with a third party. It can't work on his own, because anything he receives, if someone else gives him money, you see, it's different from shtad. Regarding a shtad, the owner gives the slave a shtad, so he receives the shtad and his freedom all at once. That's why it works. When a third party, a friend, gives him a gift of money, he never acquires the money, so he can't use the money for redemption. That's why the money doesn't work al yedei atzmo. But al yedei acherim, and now this is milo shelo mida'ato. Here's the chidush of Abaye. Kesef works. Why? Because kesef you can acquire a slave without his consent with money. When you buy a slave, you don't ask him, hey, do you want to be bought as a slave? He just bought. And so it works without his consent. So money retains that property, that it can also release a slave even without his consent, so that if a third party comes and gives money to the owner, redemption for the slave, even if the slave says, no, I want to remain a slave, doesn't matter. Money has that power to do it against his will. Okay, so now we understand that why money cannot be done with a third party. Now we ask, according to that logic, a shtad should also work with a third party, because shtad is also one of the ways of acquiring a slave, and that's without his consent. Right? You can force a slave into slavery with a shtad, and so therefore you should say also that a shtad does not need consent, and if the owner gives a shtad to a third party, I am freeing here, take this on behalf of the slave, and he is free, so it should work no matter what. So but Rabbi Meir didn't say that. So the answer is Haishtad alechud v'Haishtad alechud. When it comes to documents, each document is completely different because it has words in it. And one of them, the words say, "Behold, you are a slave." The other one says, "Behold, you are not a slave." And so it's not. Even though they're both pieces of paper with ink on it, right? They're completely different categories. So we say, want to say the same thing for money. One of them, money you use to acquire a slave. The other one you use to redeem the slave. No, the nature of money is one. Money is just money. There's no difference. You don't mint a coin for redemption and mint a different type of coin for acquisition, right? Money is just the same thing that you're using for two different purposes. Since you used this very same coin or anyone like it, all money is the same, to acquire a slave against his will, so too you can use money to free a slave even against his will. That's true for money, but not all documents are created equal. Every single document is written with a different purpose in mind. And therefore, the two documents are not comparable. So with money, you can redeem a slave against his will, but with a shtad, you cannot you cannot redeem him against his will. And now we explained all the clauses of Rabbi Meir. Rava adds yet a different possible distinction between money and shtad. Rava amar kesef kabbalat rabo garmalo, shtad kabbalat acherim garmalo. Money and shtad work in very different ways. Regarding money, it's someone else gives the money to the owner. So what causes him to be freed? It's his receipt of the money. Now the owner, he has a right to receive money, right? Anybody can receive money. And so he receives the money, and by doing that, he relinquishes his ownership of the slave. So as a consequence of that, the slave now goes free. It's not that he needs to consent or not consent. Maybe he does need to consent in a normal case. But here, it's just a secondary consequence. The first thing is that the owner receives money, and he has a right to receive money. Since he received the money, so now that's it. He gives up ownership. So that's why the slave goes free. And that works, therefore, against his will, because his will never came into it. He wasn't even part of that transaction. Where a shtad is different. A shtad, the owner has to give it to someone, to the slave or to someone on behalf of the slave, and so it's the receipt of that other party, if he's giving it to another party, that causes him to be freed. But in that case, it's a direct consequence it's a direct action, right? By the owner giving the shtad, whoever he gives it to, that is what frees the slave. And if the slave is there saying, I don't want to be freed, then it won't work without his consent. So kesef is more indirect because it goes from someone to the owner. The owner receives the money. That's allowed. And only as a next step, the slave just goes free automatically. Whereas a shtad has to be given and received by someone else. And so therefore, that's directly what causes the slave to go free. So because it goes in the other direction, that requires the consent of the slave. We now turn to the opinion of Chachamim. Chachamim omrim bechesef al yedei atzmo. A slave can acquire his own freedom with money on his own, right? So he can receive money somehow someone gives him a gift or something, and then he can give that money to his master and redeem himself. So we analyze bechesef al yedei atzmo in al yedei acherim. La, we can infer that with money he can do it himself, but not with a third party. If a third party gives money directly to the master, then he does not go free. Well, why not? Amai nehina mideshelo midato mechdi shema'na lehu l'rabanan damre zechut hu sheyeseh mitachat yad rabo lecharut v'tanena zachin adam shelo befanav ve'en chavin lo ela befanav. Why not? Even if it's without the consent of the slave, according to Rabbanan, it's a merit for someone to go free. They disagree with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, well, maybe some slaves, they want to stay and there's certain benefits. But Rabbanan say, it's always in the person's interest to be free, and therefore you don't need his consent. You can go and someone else can go give money to the master, even without the slave there, even without the slave knowing about it, and that will be effective. So why can't you use a third party? So maybe you'll say, when the Mishnah says he can acquire himself with money on his own, it means also on his own. Not only if a third party gives the master money, but even if the slave himself gives the money. Right? Obviously, if someone else gives money, it will work. But the chidush is even the slave himself. And that clause would be teaching us that a slave can acquire something without the master. If someone comes and says, here's a gift I'm giving to you, you can use it to redeem yourself. The slave can acquire something, money as a gift, and that's why he can use it. That's the chidush. Okay, fine. So now in this reading, according to Chachamim, with money, others or himself can redeem themselves with money. But now let's look at the next part. Bishtar al yedei acherim ve'lo al yedei asmo v'hakay malan gito v'yado ba'im k'echad. With the shtar, only if the master gives the shtar to a third party, then it works, but not if he gives it to the slave directly. Well, why not? Doesn't everybody agree that a slave can acquire his get and his freedom at the same time? And therefore, he should be able to go free and acquire the shtar himself. So maybe you'll say, in this clause also, it's only giving half of it, and it's saying, yes, you can acquire his freedom with a shtar through a third party. It means even through a third party, all the more so. For sure he can acquire it himself. His get and his hand come at the same time. The chidush is that the master can even give it to a third party without the slave knowing, because it's a merit for him to go free. And so that's the chidush. Okay, so now we're interpreting both clauses to be only partial, but really the slave can go free with money or with a shtar, no matter if it's a third party or he himself. If that's so, if that case, there's no reason to separate them, because you should put them all together. It's the same law. You should say a slave can go get his freedom with money, with a shtar, and it doesn't matter if it's a third party or by himself. So you put them all together if they're the same. So that can't be. Ela bekesef ben al yedei acherim ben al yedei asmo, bishtar al yedei acherim velo al yedei atzmo. V'Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar hu. So rather, we're going to read the Mishnah in it's a difficult reading, really. But so the kesef, according to Chachamim, a kesef can be acquired whether with someone else or himself. And it just said that he can acquire it himself to give us the chidush that, in fact, a slave can acquire money on their own. If someone gives them a gift, that's the chidush. And that's the opinion of Chachamim, period. The next line regarding shtar is no longer the opinion of Chachamim, but rather the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. He says regarding shtar, others yes, but himself no. In other words, according to Chachamim, if you look back here, we have now 3 opinions in the Mishnah, even though it only looks like 2. The first one is Rabbi Meir. We explain that. Chachamim say kesef al yedei asmo, period. But that means not only on his own, also with a third party. Kesef, anyone can do it, and according to Chachamim, shtad also, anyone can do a shtad. That's the opinion of Chachamim. He just said an extra chidush. He give the highlight that kesef, even by himself, he can acquire it, because yes, a slave can acquire money from a third party, even though his master is there. That's Chachamim. The next line is a different opinion. Shtad al yidei achirim. Shtad is only by someone else. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Now, how do we know his opinion? It's not explicit in the Mishnah. We know from a Braita, the Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Af bishtad al yidei achirim, velo al yidei asmo. Rabbi Shimon says, even regarding shtad, not only money, according to Rabbi Shimon, money and shtad are the same. And in both of them, it has to be a third party. Regarding money, it's more obvious why he would say that, because he says that a slave's hand is not his own. A slave cannot acquire money from someone else. So certainly there, you need the third party to give money to the owner to redeem the slave. Not only that, even regarding shtad, it has to be a third party, because the master is going to give the shtad to a third party on behalf of the slave. That works. If the master gives the shtad to the slave himself, the slave has not acquired it. Whatever the slave takes goes back to the master. He does not agree that the shtad, that the get and the yad come at the same time. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And in fact, there are three factions, v'shalosh machalokot badavar. Okay, difficult to parse the Mishnah this way, but this is the only way that Gemara can figure out to make sense of this very difficult Mishnah, which has we can figure out one paradox, but two paradoxes that are opposite is too much. Amar Rabba, my Tamad Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, what's his source? Gamar la meisha, ma'isha sheyosi get l'rshut she'ena shelo, af ebed name ad sheyosi get l'rshut she'ena shelo. We'll make a gezerah shava from the word la. It says regarding get, it says you have to give her the get, and also regarding ama ivriya, it says o chufsha lo nitan la, freedom was not given to her. And it gets says v'chatab la sefer keritut. So from these two, we learn that just like regarding a woman, the get is only effective when it leaves the husband's domain, and it has to leave the husband's domain. Yosi get l'shut shena shelo has to go to a domain that's not his, right? If he's just gonna put it on, in his own house near her, it's not good enough, because it's his house. Okay, so he has to send it outside of his house. So to Eved, the same thing. He has to the get shichrur has to go to a domain that's not his. If the owner gives it to the slave in his hand, the slave's hand is his own domain. It didn't leave yet. That's why you have to use a third party. Good. Now, follow-up question on that. Bayed Abba, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Eved Kanani Moshe Ya'aseh Shaliach lekabel gito miyad Rabbo. According to this, can an Eved Kanani appoint an agent to receive the get on his behalf? We did see that the master can give it to someone else, right? The master saying, here, receive this on behalf. But here, this case is different. Here, the agent is working for the slave. So now the slave can't receive it himself, but can he ask someone else to receive it on his behalf? Well, do we say the Gezerah Shava is effective also for this law? And just like a woman can make an agent, so too a slave can make an agent to receive the get. Or do we say it's different? A wife, she can receive the get herself, right, in her own hand. That's fine. And so therefore, she has the agency to be able to appoint a shaliach for her. Whereas in Eved, he is not able to receive the get on his own. So how could he ask a shaliach to do something that he himself can't do? So he couldn't do it. That's the two sides of the question. After he asked the question, then he answered it also, and he said, yes, this is a gezerah shava, it's effective, and we can learn that the Eved says the same law as a wife, and therefore, just like a wife can appoint an agent to receive it, so too the Eved can, even though he can't receive it himself, he can appoint an agent to receive it on his behalf. It's only his hand that's the problem, that's under the domain of the master, but his agent's hand is a separate domain. Hanikane shulchet rachamananinu, diisha salka datech shulchat didaninu, mika midi de'anan lama senan abdinan, ve'inu maseh abdeh. So this conclusion here, that an Eved cannot receive his own get, but can appoint someone else to receive a get, prompts the following question, because Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yoshua, asked the question. Hey, we're wondering, Kohanim in general, are they our messengers, humans, or God's messengers? They're doing God's work. They're making sacrifices. Is that because God said, I want you to make sacrifices, so they're doing God's work? Or do they represent us, all of Bnei Israel, a Korban Tamid? Everybody has to join into Korban Tamid, so therefore everyone is appointing them and they're acting on our behalf. So they're kind of both. They're kind of intermediaries. But legally, technically, which one is it? So he concluded that it must be that the Kohanim are messengers of heaven. Why? Because if you say they were our messengers, do you ever have anything where the person himself cannot do something, but the messenger can do it? A regular Yisrael, cannot go and make a korban, not allowed. Yet a Kohen can do it. So it doesn't make sense. Well, I can't do a korban, but I can appoint someone. I can't do a korban, but I can appoint someone else to make a korban for me. No, impossible. So therefore, Rav Huna said the Kohanim must be working for God. They are God's messengers. Now we question this. Velo, is that logic really good? Veha abda deihu lamase mekabel gite v'shalech maseh meshaveh. Here we have an example of an Aved that he cannot receive his own get, yet he can appoint someone to receive it on his behalf. So there are such cases where I can't do it myself, but I can appoint someone else. So it could very well be that the Kohanim are working for us, and even though I can't make a korban myself, I can appoint him to do it for me. And so this conclusion would not be necessary. But then we say, no, velohi Yisrael la shecheh b'tzurat korbanot kelal, ha'eved shayach begitin. The Tanya nir'in devarim sha'eved mekabel gito, shel chavero miyad rabo shel chavero, aval lo miyad rabo shelo. In fact, there is a difference between them. A Yisrael, a non-Kohen, is not involved, can't be involved in offerings at all. There is no scenario in which a Yisrael is allowed to do the shechita, but from then on can't do any of the other avodot, right? And it never happens, impossible. Whereas in Eved, there is a situation where an Eved can acquire a get, and that's when he acquires it for someone else. Because the Braita says, it seems true that an Eved can receive the get on behalf of his friend from his friend's master. So if the master of this slave wants to free his slave, he can give the get to a different slave who's under a different master. And even though in that case, well, then it would go to that master, that's fine, doesn't matter. He can receive it on behalf, or the master receives it on behalf, as long as it's someone else from a different household. That will work and the slave will go free. So therefore there is a scenario in which an Eved can be involved in receiving a get, and so therefore he can also appoint an agent on his behalf to receive his own get. And so we answer that question. Now, the last line of the Mishnah clarified something for Chachamim and said, Bilvad sheyeh kesef mishel acherim. Chachamim said that a slave can acquire his own money. It is possible to do for him to have ownership of money. As long as it's not his own, he doesn't just pick it up. If he picks it up, it's no good. It has to be that someone else gave it to him. It has to be third-party money transferred to the slave, and then the slave can use it for his redemption. Now, what's the machloket fundamentally between Rabbi Meir, who says a slave cannot acquire his own money, and Chachamim? Rabbi Meir says a slave cannot acquire anything from anything from a third party without the master getting it, and that's equivalent to a wife also cannot acquire something for herself because anything she acquires goes to her husband. That's Rabbi Meir, and that's why he can't do it. Rabbanan say that a slave can acquire something and a wife can acquire something, and it doesn't necessarily go to the master or to the husband. And so it seems that they're arguing on this very fundamental question. So we like to minimize the machloket if possible, so we do that in two ways. No, we can even say that everyone agrees that there is no acquisition of a slave or a wife without it going to the master or the husband. Even Chachamim would agree to that. We're talking about when a third party gives money to the slave and adds a condition. It says here, I'm giving this to you on condition that your master will not have a right to it. If you add a condition, that's the machloket. Does that work or not? If you don't have no condition, then everyone agrees there's no way to acquire it. Even Chachamim, but Chachamim will say that this condition is effective. Rabbi Meir savar ki amar le kane ebed kane rabeh v'chi amar le almenat la kelum kamar le. According to Rabbi Meir, as soon as the third party says, "Here, take this money," then the money goes to the slave acquires it, but it immediately goes to the master right through him, and so the slave does not keep it. And even though he said almenat, we ignore the condition. The condition is worthless. It doesn't help at all. Whether you make the condition or not, the slave does not get the money. Whereas Rabbanan almenat, according to Rabbanan, since he says on condition, so you see the condition works, because if when the slave takes it, it would go to the master. Well, then the condition is not fulfilled, so the master doesn't get it. So by putting in, right, as on condition that your master doesn't get it, so then it will remain in the hands of the slave, and then the slave can use it as he wishes, and he can go and take that money and redeem himself, give it to the master and say, I'm redeeming myself, and that will work. And so now we minimize the machloket only to a case where you have a condition. Or an alternate formula, I want to minimize it even more, Rabbi Elazar says, and even if you add a condition, everybody agrees, we ignore the condition. If you took the money, the slave took the money, it goes right to the master. Here the machloket is a case where the third party who's giving the money to the slave says, I'm giving you this money on condition that you will be emancipated with it. This is even now more interesting. Rabbi Meir savar ki amar le kene eved v'kene rabeh v'chi amar le almenat lo kelum ka'amar le. Rabbi Meir sticks to his guns and says, even in this case, once the slave gets the money, it goes immediately to the master, and we ignore any condition. I don't care what you said after the condition. The money is the master's, and the slave that did nothing, the slave is not free. But Rabbanan in this case, with this formula, according to Rabbi Elazar, say that for he does not transfer to the money to the slave himself. He doesn't need to transfer the money to the slave, because he said on condition that you're emancipated with it. So in effect, it works because the slave is acting kind of like a shaliach for the master. If the third party had given the money to the master himself, certainly that would work, right? He gets the money from a third party. That's the standard case of redemption. So what's the difference if I give it? If I'm redeeming the slave, if I give it to the owner or give it to the slave, and I tell the slave, this will be your money of redemption, right? On condition that you are redeemed with this. So in that case, it doesn't go as a gift to the slave and therefore automatically as a gift to the owner, but rather goes through the slave to the owner as the money of redemption. And that is a way in which you can redeem a slave. It has to be third-party money originating, but it can be given to the slave on condition that will be his emancipation money. And then, yes, the master will acquire it, that's true, but that's okay. It has to get to the master eventually, so that the master will then take the money, and by taking the money, emancipate the slave. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen, Amen.